Erev Tov. Good evening, everybody. I'm very excited for many reasons. So I need your compassion. First of all, I'm very excited that Professor Wוכטel is here with us. For many people here in the audience, the quality time with you in the books and the articles, sometimes in the videos, but to have you really here is a great honor for us and it's a great opportunity for a real meeting. And I personally very exciting. The second is that we plan to have a talk. And so for psychologists, the talk should be an easy thing, but it's in English. And we will try to Anat and me discussed with Paul, and we really want to have a conversation in such an auditorium in English. It's a challenge, but we like challenges, so I hope we'll be able to real dialogue with Paul and to use the opportunity that he's here with us to really have a dialogue and meeting of minds around psychotherapy integration. I will introduce Paul, and then Anat and me will ask Paul a few questions that we hope will help him to introduce his main idea to this audience, but not from only from theoretical point of view, but also from a personal point of view. And along the evening, we will try to open the discussion between the audience and Paul. Okay? So, Professor Paul Wooghtel is a distinguished professor in City University in Manhattan, New York. He is part of the PhD clinical program there, and he's also a member of the faculty of the postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in NYU. His PhD is from Yale, and since the 70s, he is I may say, the key leader or one of the key leaders of the integration movement in psychotherapy. His book, Psychoanalysis and Behavior Therapy, that was published in 1977, was a real breakthrough in the world of psychotherapy, and since then he published a lot of books and articles, and his main model, Cyclical Psychodynamics, became one of the leading models in psychotherapy integration. But more than that is the spirit behind Sepi, the Society for Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, and the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration, and a lot of activities around psychotherapy integration around the world. He visited a lot of countries, teach psychotherapy integration, and really created a community and a language. One of the greatest impressions that your writing had on me is when I wrote your description of how Sepi was established and your fight that it will not be defined as the Society for Integrative Psychotherapy, but your insistence that the name will be, the focus will be on psychotherapy integration, and that this nuance, if we are dealing with psychotherapy integration or with integrative psychotherapy, became one of the main ideas that influenced my thought. I also want to introduce Professor Anat Bronstein-Klomek, who is the head of the clinical program in the ITC, and she invited Paul. He's giving a summer course in the clinical program in ITC, and we were very enthusiastic to use this opportunity to enable this meeting with the community. So our first question, Paul, or you want to add something to the introduction?
No, that's fine. I'm very happy with the introduction.
So my first question is that what was, if you can identify the process through which, or the moment in which you became an integrationist?
Well, it actually, I remember it very vividly because it came out of, I was at the time, there was, at NYU where I was teaching at the time, there was a research center for mental health, which was a psychoanalytically oriented research center. And it was headed by Robert Holt and George Klein, who were two of the leading figures at the time. And George Klein was a very kind of difficult, dismissive man. He was very enamored of himself. But he had in many ways good reason to be. He was a very smart, very successful man. But he loved to sort of show how he was above everything. And so he was invited to participate in a panel at the American Psychological Association, and he decided that it was sort of beneath him to be part of that panel, and he would have one of the peasants at the research center do it, and I was the designated peasant. So I was assigned to be part of this panel, and it was a panel that was about a book by Walter Mischel called Personality and Assessment. And Mischel was, in that book, very, very critical of psychoanalytic ideas. And he was a social learning theorist, and wasn't so much a therapist, but he was an advocate of behavior therapy, which I knew very little about. I had been trained psychoanalytically, and I had been trained in the way that now everybody is trained, which is unfortunately, here is your point of view, no other point of view is of any interest whatsoever. You can remain ignorant of every other point of view except what your teachers are teaching you. So I did learn psychoanalytic thinking very intensively. I had no interest in behavior therapy whatsoever, but I needed to learn a little bit about it in order to be part of this panel where, in order to be able to dismiss it effectively, I had to know a little bit about it. So that's how I got infected with the virus of listening to other points of view. I had to study it, and when I studied it, two things really struck me. The first was, it wasn't as superficial or foolish or ungrounded as I had been taught, that there was something serious to pay attention to. The second was that it actually wasn't quite as alien to the version of psychoanalytic thinking that had begun to evolve for me, that I could see ways they fit together. So it was out of being the designated peasant that my interest in integration began.
For the audience, and just as a self-disclosure, I told Paul has been speaking yesterday and today all morning through afternoon. So I promised him that we will make this a conversation. And I like the way that he presented it, that it's going to be a good evening and an interesting evening if we're able to ask him questions that he wasn't prepared to answer. So this is a challenge for us and for you guys. But I will start with basics, so we have grounds for more and more interesting stuff. Maybe tell us about what that integration means for you from that point.
Well, I think as Sharon was saying earlier, for me, integration is particularly a process. It's not an end point. It's a way of thinking in which one questions the sort of the received wisdom of whatever one's point of view is. It's a kind of questioning attitude and a seeking attitude. I think it probably fits with some part of me that feels deeply insufficient, because it's a kind of embracing of insufficiency. It's the sort of sense that whatever I know is not quite enough, and there must be people out there who know things I don't. So I think it's most of all an attitude, and I think there are then, in a way, multiple integrations, that there isn't a kind of single integrative theory, because if there were, it would cease to have an integrative spirit. It would feel complete in itself. It's really a kind of a seeking after other viewpoints, a curiosity, an interest in what other points of view have been, and then thinking about where is it different and where is it similar. I think in general, I'm very interested always in those sort of two-sided questions. You know, where is it similar? Where is it different? I began to notice at a certain point, even when I saw videos of my own sessions, I began to notice things I would say to patients that also had that two-sided quality. I would say, does it feel like this, or does it feel like that? There would always be, even though, of course, there can be more than two sides to any question, I'm always sort of looking at what's the other side. So I think of it in those sort of process terms in some way. Hopefully, you know, as we go through this evening, I will convey something of my own particular approach to integration. Okay, and you know, I will do that. Well, I'll to begin with. Let me start with one part, but then again, you know, I'm hoping it becomes as much of a dialogue as we can create in this structure where we're behind the barrier with the microphones and you're all out there. But one of the things that particularly characterized the first challenge I had to face in this integration, the challenge of coming to terms with Walter Mischel's point of view. One of the ways that Mischel dismissed psychoanalysis was he was highlighting the importance of the situational influences on behavior and on experience to a lesser degree, because he was less interested in subjective experience, but certainly on behavior and somewhat on experience, the impact of the situation. And his point of view was that psychoanalysts, and he also included among his opponents academic researchers who were trait psychologists, who were looking at consistencies in personality across situations. And he said something that really was striking to me, which was that if you look at the evidence supporting cross-situational traits, that very same evidence, the very same studies that people cite to say, look, People who have strong superegos have strong superegos here, here, and here. People who are anxious here, here, and here, etc., any kind of trait conception. Said if you look at the evidence that supports it, it's usually correlations between 0.3 and 0.4, and that those correlations mean that you're accounting for 10 or 15% of the variance. So the evidence that there is consistency could also be seen as evidence that there is inconsistency, because 85% of the variance is not in the personality. Now that's a somewhat slippery argument, and we can talk about the details of it, but it caught my eye, and it made me think, and it made me realize that my own understanding of psychoanalysis as it was evolving, and it was an understanding that had been strongly influenced at that point by the ideas particularly of Karen Horney and Harry Stack Sullivan. So it was a more interpersonal, more contextual understanding of psychoanalysis. This was before the relational point of view really had emerged. And so my understanding of psychoanalysis was not a purely internal, intrapsychic understanding, but it nonetheless was an understanding that there was a personality organization that was important to understand, even if that organization was a contextual organization. So I began to think, well, okay, there's something to be said for Michel's situational emphasis. There's something to be said for the psychoanalytic emphasis on the internal structure. How do we put those two together? He had persuaded me that I needed to pay attention to the situation, but he hadn't persuaded me that that meant I didn't have to pay attention to subjective organization or experience. And as I began to think about how do we put together that there's internal states, motivations, fantasies, thought processes, schemas, conceptions that matter, and that the situation we're in matters, out of that emerged what I came eventually to call cyclical psychodynamics, which is that if you look at how people live, what happens is we do act in the world on the basis of how we experience ourselves, experience other people, see other people, organize our perceptions, all of those internal organizing principles that psychoanalysts talk about. But once we act in the world acts on us. That there is it's not a one-directional causal effect. What Michel points out also is true. One of Michel's favorite examples is if you are about to cross the street and some cars are coming, is it more useful to know whether the person driving is impulsive or homicidal, or is it more useful to know whether the light is red or green? And whether the light is red or green is probably a better predictor of whether it's safe to cross the street. That's true. I also would love to know if the person is homicidal who's coming at me, whether the light is red or green. So I want to know about both, and I want to know how, in that case, I don't think red or green lights create homicidal behavior or vice versa, but in everyday life, how we act does influence how others act toward us, which does influence how we see the world, which does influence how we act the next time, which does influence how other people treat us, which does influence how we again either maintain or change our internal structures, that life is largely organized in a circular rather than a linear way. As I've just said it still sounds a little schematic to me. It may not be very clear yet what I'm getting at, but hopefully that will emerge in our discussion. But I'm going to stop my answer at this point just so it doesn't become a monologue.
Okay. We screened the Mobius Trick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I practiced this. So would you like to connect the Mobius Trick to this idea?
Okay. As a psychodynamic thinker, I tend to emphasize early childhood somewhat less than many other psychoanalysts do, but nonetheless, I will here enjoy returning to kindergarten and tearing up pieces of paper and folding pieces of paper. So this was something I had demonstrated at IDC just either today or yesterday. It's something, as an undergraduate, before I turned to psychology, I was a physics major for several years. And so I had to learn a lot of mathematics, and I learned about the work of Mobius, or he was German, so I think his probably was actually pronounced Mobius. He was I think 19th century mathematician, and he did all sorts of complicated theorizing that I don't understand, but I'm writing something, this is the word outside, okay? And you can make your own Mobius strip even as we speak. If you have a piece of paper you want to strip up. If I write outside on one side and I'm writing inside on the other, and I fold it like that, this is the outside, this is the inside. So far, not terribly profound, right? But at least it reinforces our sense of reality, which is always a good thing. If you go around and around and around on the outside, you never get to the inside. The inside is inside, the outside is outside. This is in some way the psychoanalytic model of personality, okay? There are other ways to represent it. Obviously, Freud loved that little thing with the ego and the id and so on. But the point is, what happens on the outside, the life experiences we have now, don't affect the inside in this model. And that captures something about the way a lot, not all by any means, and it's changing, but the way a lot of psychoanalytic thinkers, especially in the early years, but even to this day, think about personality. Greenberg and Mitchell, in their classic book, Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory, talk about the psychoanalytic presumption that the social is superficial and that it is the depths of personality that really generate the deepest change. So we can sort of leave out all the things that are really happening in the world and only go into fantasy. Well, it didn't take the Mobius strip for me to be questioning that, but the Mobius strip, when I thought of it at a certain point, captured very well a different way of thinking about it. The magic thing about a Mobius strip is if instead of folding it like this, you do one little twist. And if you don't know what a Mobius strip is, do this at home. It's a fun thing, and it'll be especially fun to show your kids. Because now, if you run your finger from the outside and keep going, as you go along the outside, now you come to the inside in a continuous way, and then you go back to the outside. The inside and the outside are one surface. They come back and forth to each other. And that, to me, the reason I liked that image, the reason Sharon is talking about my using that image, is it was a way of illustrating. It's only a metaphor. It's not in itself a psychological model. It's not an evidence-based idea. It's a metaphor. But it's a metaphor that captures the way I think human life works, which is the inside and the outside are not separate surfaces. They're not separate realms. They're continually interacting. Who I am, for example, at this very moment, who I am is shaped by your being here. And my state of consciousness, the associations I have, the feelings I have, are different in this room than they would be in another context. The context influences it, but at the same time, how I am is going to influence how you respond to me, which will further influence how I am. Hopefully, I will appear to you as somebody who is interested in engaging you and a friendly figure, so you will respond to me in a friendly way, and then I will respond to you that way. But if somehow some version of how I am being friendly evokes for one of you a memory of somebody who appeared to be friendly but actually was dangerously hostile, and you want to head this off right away and you start to shout at me something nasty, something different will start to come out of me, and the whole nature of this interaction will change. We're constantly reproducing each other, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a real deep self in each of us, but it's a contextual self. The relational concept of multiple self-states in some way captures that multiplicity, the many potentials we have. But that concept often is not contextualized sufficiently, in the sense that it's treated as if there are almost like spontaneous quantum leaps, where suddenly we jump from one self-state to another. The better we understand the context that elicits these different self-states, and the way each self-state can be nuanced in a different way as new experiences are encountered and as we create new experiences. All of these back and forths that constitute life, that's part of what this image is about.
And how do you technically translate it into clinical technique?
Okay, that's of course the big question. Part of the answer is sometimes very well and sometimes not so well. But I know that wasn't what you meant, but that's an important part of the truth. What it means is that very often what I am interested in, particularly with my patients, is in identifying the vicious circles that characterize their life. And by the way, not just the vicious circles, but also the virtuous circles, because I think it's really important that we root our efforts not just in psychopathology, not just in images of what is wrong with the person, but in the person's strengths and what brings out those strengths. So if I encounter a patient who is feeling a particularly distressing experience, one of the things I want to know is what elicits that feeling, what has been going on. As part of my interest also in the strengths, and it relates to what I was saying before about these two-sided ways of thinking, you know, how is it similar, how is it different? One example of that in the clinical setting would be, I would be very interested much of the time as I hear about the experience, when do you feel this more and when do you feel it less? So what I'm indicating is that I am interested in both all the time. That I am, when I ask about your strengths, I'm not brushing aside the weaknesses. When I ask about your weaknesses, I'm not brushing aside the strengths. I'm interested in how they all combine in your being you, and I'm interested in what are the circumstances, the interactions that lead to these feelings. So I'll want to know what is happening to you, what happened in this experience, what elicited the feeling, how did you respond to it. I'm looking at the details, the fine-grained details of the interaction to see what elicits what. But I'm looking at it not from a kind of behavioristic external vantage point. I'm looking at it in a way that is also concerned with what are the deeply experiential qualities that go along with it. One association I have to that's not quite an answer to Sharon's question, but I'll probably do that a lot tonight, sort of not answer the question because something else occurs to me, and you can then pull me back. Don't let me get away with that and slip away. But from the beginning, when I, as a psychoanalyst, got interested in behavior therapy, one of the things that happened and one of the things that persuades me of the importance of integration has to do with the tribal nature of the way our field is organized. You know, you belong to a tribe. You're a psychoanalyst, and therefore the CBT people are other. You're a cognitive behavior therapist, therefore the analysts are other. And within each tribe, there are, of course, sub-tribes. If you're a Kleinian, you may not look kindly on a Lacanian, and so on and so forth. All of that leads to kind of almost intentional, not only dismissal, but misunderstandings. One of the basic ones, starting with the sort of the largest tribe, psychoanalytic, and when I started it was behavioral, then it became cognitive behavioral. My psychoanalytic colleagues, I went through, after my PhD, full psychoanalytic training at NYU postdoc. I graduated from there. I was told they were very interested in my joining the faculty there. I am a member of the faculty now, but there was a period where I sort of was not so welcome for a while. Why was I not so welcome? I was, quote, a behaviorist. I was no longer a psychoanalyst at all. I was a behaviorist, which was a double misunderstanding because A, I always remained more psychoanalytic in my core. Not that that's better, but it just is who I was. Second, I was equally in my core an integrationist, interested in these other points of view, but maybe most important in terms of the sheer misunderstanding, I got interested in behavior therapy in part because the more I studied it, the more clear it was to me that behavior therapists were among the least behavioristic therapists anywhere I could find. That what behavior therapists really were phenomenologists. They, of course, would be equally insulted by my describing them that way, but they were. For example, as I got interested in behavior therapy, I wasn't prepared, having gone through years of psychoanalytic training, wasn't prepared to go through the whole thing again, learning behavior therapy, but I did want to learn it fairly intensively. So I found a variety of ways of making contact with the behavior therapists that were on the East Coast of the United States and contacting them and trying to learn from them in some way. And one of the ways I did it was I went to a summer institute that Joseph Wolpe, one of the early prominent behavior therapists, was running in Philadelphia. And this was like a behavior therapy boot camp, like Marine training for behavior therapists. You started at 8 in the morning and you went till midnight. And interestingly, the only time in my life I went through complete psychoanalytic training, I never saw a patient 5 times a week. I would see patients sometimes 3 times a week, occasionally 4. Never saw a patient 5 times a week in analysis. At Wolpe's Institute, I saw patients 5 times a week. Why? Because we only had a month. He wanted to see change, so we saw the patients every day. But one of the things Wolpe did is, one of the things he was famous for was the SUD scale, the scale of subjective units of distress. It's a way of seeing how anxious is the patient when, for example, you're doing systematic desensitization. Let's say it's a simple dog phobia, and you're treating the patient. You want to know if, you know, their anxiety might be at 100, if there is a German Shepherd within 6 inches of them barking loudly and growling, and it might be at a 50 if there's a Cocker Spaniel that is at the other end of the room, and it might be at a 10 if there's a little Chihuahua down at the next block. There's a gradient. And he would be taking measures of how anxious are you. But I had studied, when I had been an undergraduate, when I changed from physics to psychology, I was at Columbia at the time, and Columbia was very Skinnerian in their psychology department. So I was taught by a lot of Skinnerians. And they taught me about a kind of pure behaviorism that Wolpe didn't have any clue about. As a pure behaviorist, if Wolpe were really a behaviorist, when the patient says, my SUD score is a 50, and then the SUD score changes to 60, all you're doing is changing the behavior. You're teaching the person to say the word, as you're desensitizing. If I were really a behaviorist, I would think all I'm doing is teaching them to say 30 instead of 40. Teaching them to emit the word 20 instead of 30. It would just be teaching them that behavior. Wolpe took it appropriately, I think, as an indication of their subjective state. He was interested not in their changing the numbers that they could say as behavior. He was interested in what's your subjective state. He was interested in subjectivity. And he took people's self-reports actually in a much more sort of naively introspectionist way than any psychoanalyst would, because psychoanalysts approached it in a more behavioristic way. Psychoanalysts would approach it as, you say you love your mother and you did this, this, and this, doesn't sound like you love your mother. They're looking at the actual behavior, not the self-report. So it was Wolpe who was giving priority to self-report. It was the psychoanalysts who were giving priority to the actual behavior. The world was very mixed up. It was kind of like a Mobius strip even back then.
So, when you became integrationist and when conceptualizing the cyclical psychodynamic, I'm sorry for persisting on the clinical experience.
No, that's good.
So I understand that you hear the cycling between the inside and the outside, and there is a reciprocal tension between how the world shape us and how we shape the world that shapes us, and that as I read your work, so the main idea that looking for the psychic world, it's not just going to the past and deeper, is that looking on the interaction between the inside and the outside, and how we are, what is the dialogue between the inside and the outside. But I'm focusing on the how your intervention, the way, not the way you understand the patient, but the way you are mobilizing a change was affected by this idea. Because, as a psychoanalytically, basically oriented psychotherapist, I know that the way we listen is affecting the person. The listening is not just listening. Listening is creating a process. But above this change, above the mentalization change, how the way you try to intervene was changed.
Okay. One of the things that I would do is exactly what Sharon just did. If you see that the patient is resisting and not really responding to what you're trying to do, you persistently come back, and that's good therapeutic technique. Let me give a brief, simple example. Suppose you have a patient who is very inhibited, unassertive, and kind of whatever happens, everything is okay. People want to do this, okay, I'll do that. People want to do this, okay, I'll do that. Boss asks him to stay late at the job, okay, sure, no problem. And you have lots of indications that actually he's really angry about this, and he's conflicted about that anger, and he feels there's no room for him to express it. But most of this is unconscious. You're making psychodynamic inferences based on behavior, based on the language he uses, the avoidances, the things, all the kinds of cues that we use to make psychoanalytic inferences. And there is some value, certainly, I continue to believe, in helping him to understand that, suppose, let's say the patient came in and he's not even coming in complaining about, my boss asked me to do this, but my wife tells me she wants me home, and I don't know, I can't say no to either of them. And he comes in because he has headaches, he's kind of depressed. Those are the final pathway of this conflict. You can pursue it through trying to promote insight, awareness of the complexities of his feelings, of what he's keeping out. And that has some value. But the problem is that if he finds that, if he feels being angry is dangerous, and part of what happens is if you're living the kind of life that I was just very superficially describing, but you have, I think, some image of the kind of person I'm talking about, you're constantly encountering experiences that infuriate you, that frustrate you. But you don't know what to do with those feelings. You haven't really learned how to express it. If you think about, say, the ordinary, the healthy developmental course, with anger or with any other feeling, you know, if you see a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who never has a tantrum, never gets angry, never throws things, never says no, you're almost certainly looking at a child who's probably going to have problems later on in life. But if you look at a 15-year-old who says no the same way that the 3-year-old says no, you're of course also looking at someone who's going to have problems in life. We go through developmental sequences. We learn how to express and shape the inchoate affective inclinations that we're experiencing so that they work in the world and feel comfortable and satisfying, or at least effective, because it's not always comfortable to be in disagreement with someone else. And it gets shaped. The way the 2-year-old expresses anger is different from the way the 4-year-old expresses anger, which is different from the way the 8-year-old expresses anger, and so on. We learn, it gets shaped. But if you are avoiding that as much as possible, you're being deprived of these crucial developmental shaping experiences that help to make anger safer and more effective in living. Because the point of anger ultimately is not just to vent, it's to change something that's bothering us. And so I would be hypothesizing with the kind of patient I was just describing who stays late when the boss asks late, but then does this when another person asks this, and who's pulled in this way and that way because he can't say no because he's afraid of being angry. That partly he's afraid of being angry because he truly doesn't fully know how to be effectively angry. If he has from very early avoided as much as possible integrating anger as with any emotion, expressing affection, expressing need, expressing hope, expressing help me. It's not just anger, but I'm taking that as one example. We learn how to shape and mold our emotions so that they are true to us and yet true to the situation we're dealing with and have a useful effect in the world. And if we haven't done that, if we haven't gone through those developmental experiences, then as an adult, we're in a very precarious situation. Anger is constantly being stirred because he's constantly being taken advantage of. But by now, his fear of being angry is no longer just the fear of however the experiences with his parents were when he was 1 or 2 or 3 that started him on this course. His fear includes that he really doesn't know how to be an angry adult or an assertive adult, an adult who stands up for himself. He really doesn't know. He may have some vague approximation. If he goes to the movies, he sees other people doing it. He kind of knows in his head there are other ways, but he doesn't really know in his gut. He doesn't really know in his voice, in his behavior, in his actions. And so when I'm working with someone like that, I'm interested in his knowing more about what he's feeling, his coming to terms with that, his understanding it, but I'm also interested in helping him to express it effectively, in sort of giving him a kind of crash course in how do you express anger in the world? How do you express affection in the world? How do you say to somebody, I'm feeling anxious, can you reassure me? How do you say to somebody, I like you? How do you say to somebody, any of the various things that the parts of our lives that work, we're good at. And I think it's part of the role, especially if you are psychodynamically able to identify some of the aspects of human living that the person has left out, then we should also be working on how do you help the person bring that back in. And if you just point out the anger and just encourage the anger, without actually working with him on how do you structure it, let's practice. What would it feel like? What might you say to your boss when he says, and this includes, of course, not just exploding at the boss, not even necessarily expressing anger. It includes, obviously, assertiveness. The first thing one would hope he does is not to get angry at the boss at all, initially, but to say to the boss, I can't do it tonight, I have this to do, or whatever. But as the boss is pressuring him, how do you stand up for yourself? And if he just gets in touch with, I realize now I'm a lot angrier at the boss than I thought I was, and he's been really mistreating me. I'm going to tell this fucking guy what to do. Then you won't get paid your fee because your patient is unemployed. So you really need to help to structure it. Sometimes you need to do it in a very formal, systematic way, sometimes in an informal way by kind of modeling, by saying, what would it be like to say to your boss, and you give an example. You're not telling him what to say, but you're putting ideas out, you're giving images. But if you hear that he's likely to start expressing this, getting in more touch with what he was feeling in a way that's just going to reprove to him that those feelings are dangerous, then instead of encouraging to go out and express it, you might encourage him to wait a while. Let's work on this a little bit before you do, so it really works. So that you're paying attention to all of the internal experiences, the wishes, the fears, the affects that he has pushed away, but you're paying also attention to how he's living in the world, how he's expressing it, what the consequences are likely to be. All right, that's a kind of first answer that I hope is a little bit less evasive, though it's obviously not a full picture.
We invite you to ask, to comment, to discuss.
Another time conversing with Sharon about the model, I was always asking myself, but you need to start somewhere. So how do you assess in your model where to start? From the inside, from the outside, psychodynamically, CBT-wise? What's your ways? Your navigation system? And that's something that I'm perplexed by, so I'm not sure. And I've read quite a few of your works, so I'm interested in how you think, like where you're going to. And actually, where do you start? How do you start?
Well, I think you're appropriately perplexed because I sometimes describe it in a perplexing way. And I describe it in a perplexing way, or at least in an ambiguous way, because I truly believe we start in different places with different patients. I think the most fundamental rule for where we start is we are kind of engaged in a little experiment with each patient. We're interacting with them and we're seeing which way of being with them they are responsive to. So I think one kind of answer to your question is because of my own temperament and my own developmental experiences in the profession, having been trained psychoanalytically as my first way of working, and it's still closest to my core, I probably am inclined more often to start from attending to the person's conflicts, subjective experience, affects. That's what I tend to look at first. I don't think it's necessarily the single right place to start. I think there are, if it is a vicious circle, you can intervene at any point in the circle. But it also, even though that's my general inclination, it will vary from patient to patient. So there are patients where I spend a lot of time mainly talking about what I sense they're feeling, or talking about what kinds of feelings they don't seem comfortable allowing themselves to have. With some patients, I will talk more about what is going on in the room. With other patients, I'll talk more about what's going on in their daily life. With some patients, I mainly listen and they take the lead, and I sort of intervene when I think they need some help with it or they need some direction. With other patients, I can be quite directive and really make suggestions about what they might try between now and the next session. So I think the ambiguity about where we start is because there really are multiple starting points that partly reside in the therapist, partly reside in the patient, partly reside in the pairing of the two. That's an evasion also, but that's an evasion I will stand behind. When Sharon caught me evading, I owned up. Here I'm evading because I think evasion is at the heart of the issue, in a way. Or not evasion, but ambiguity or multiplicity.
Just a continuation of that thought. I thought one of the parameters to decide is the level of anxiety. The level of anxiety the patient comes with. Because probably that's one of the factors that would determine how you would deal with it. The anxiety from the treatment itself, from the interaction. Would that I thought that would be one of the parameters that you would decide which kind of approach you would approach the patient. Am I clear?
To your opinion, if the patient is more anxious, you'll start from?
I thought by the kind of navigation that Prochaska and
The Clemente.
And so on, the question is where the patient is in comparison to their own treatment, and how much they are motivated, or where they are in comparison to what can happen. And I would use that as a kind of a roadmap, but I'm just throwing it as a question or possibility.
Well, I think part of what I would say about that, and I am thinking now about the stages of change model. I realize in some way that since I have moved in an integrative direction, which is by now a long time, but I can still remember when I worked more exclusively psychoanalytic. I think mostly I feel positive about my having moved in that direction. I mean, obviously I wouldn't have stayed there for so long if I didn't. But I also am aware, for example, that when I was more purely psychoanalytic, I was more patient as a therapist. That in some way I now am a little bit more impatient. I want something to happen. I'm not as comfortable sitting and waiting session after session after session after session after session after session, etc. And sometimes that's to the patient's good because it interrupts a kind of endless resistance. Sometimes it's not because some people need that patience. One of the other things that makes me think about is one of the skills that I wish most therapists had, including myself, very much including myself, is the skill in recognizing as early as possible, is this somebody I should be working with, or is this somebody I should be referring? I think in some way the biggest breakthrough in psychotherapy in coming years, the biggest source of how will psychotherapy be more effective, has probably less to do with advancements in techniques and more to do with advancements in our understanding who should be working with whom. Because just the way, whether it's lovers or friendships or colleagues, there are people we match well with and people we don't. The same is true with patients. But we sort of sit in our offices and we expect that we should be the universal donor. That anybody who comes in, we should be able to treat and we should just modify what we do to make sure we fit with them. But there are people we work better with and people we don't. And I think one of the hardest things for me as a therapist is when I've begun working with somebody and I realize a little bit too late that this is somebody who probably I'm not the right therapist for. But by now, you're really stuck in something because as you try to raise that, you're facing the danger that the patient will feel hurt and rejected by you. And we can stay stuck in that for a long time trying to work that through. So that's some of what I'm thinking of in response to your question.
There's a company, by the way, in England that uses artificial intelligence to match patients and therapists. just for we met them in Berlin in the CBT conference. And it's active, it's working in the health system in NIH in England.
How do they do it?
They have parameters they collect with artificial intelligence. They just say, let's find the best match, and the system will categorize personality attributes of patients. And you know, artificial intelligence is something that you just give it an objective and it finds its own ways. But they don't match just anyone to anyone. And it's active, it's already running.
I'm very interested in learning more about that, and if they can do that, that's wonderful. I am very aware at the same time.
They plan to do the therapy at some stage.
I'm simultaneously aware. I mean, I think there are clearly remarkable things that are happening with regard to artificial intelligence. At the same time, I'm aware of how often I do a Google search and I can't find what I'm looking for. So it's a work in progress, is my guess, but it's worth paying attention to, absolutely.
I still want to try to understand your specific point of view, and my question is, I hope it will be helpful, is my question, I hope it will take us to understand a little bit specifically, is compared to relational work. Hello? Compared with relational work, which when I heard you, it didn't sound that different, because relational work takes into account the outside world, the other, the influences he has on us, the context. Could you try to discern your point of view from relational thinking?
Okay, that's a really helpful question. That gives me an opportunity to helps me to be aware of what I haven't clarified yet. To begin with, I think part of the reason that you perceived that similarity accurately is I think of my own cyclical psychodynamic point of view as one version of relational thinking. So I do think of myself as relational. I think that's correct. At the same time, when I look at a lot of other relational ways of working, I also see differences. For example, one of the central interests of relational analysts at this point is enactments, paying a lot of attention to enactments, ways in which the patient and the therapist are drawn into repeating experiences that have characterized the patient's life for a long time. Among the ways that my version of relational thinking, because it's not something different from relational, it's like the difference between a Toyota and a car. They're not fundamentally different. A Toyota is a kind of car. So mine is a kind of relational thinking. But what distinguishes my Toyota, and mine is only a Toyota, it's not a Mercedes-Benz, unfortunately, is that, for example, with enactments, two things that come to mind. And again, I'm going to draw a distinction, but it will be appropriate to say, well, the distinction isn't quite as sharp as I'm making it, but I'm highlighting the distinctions just to try to answer as well as I can. One is that even something in the way that I said it just now, I'm going to come back to repeating how I described something, I think differs from the way my experiences of most other relational analysts that I interact with or read the work of. When I think of an enactment, I describe it to myself and to the patient as something we have both gotten caught in, a pattern we both fell into. That makes, and that's partly something that also I think I've borrowed from my interest in family systems thinking. That's been another important influence. In my own work, it started out psychoanalytic and behavioral and then cognitive behavioral, but then other points of view entered in, so systemic thinking, experiential approaches, and so on also contribute. One of the things that I highlight is that we are caught in a pattern. It's not just that you are repeating a pattern with me. Many relationalists still rely on concepts like projective identification, for example. And often that comes down to some version of you're trying to get rid of a certain feeling, so you put it into me. And I'm feeling it because you've put it into me. I instead would think of it as I'm feeling it because that's how it feels to be caught in this kind of interaction that we are both a part of. It's not a radical difference from standard relational thinking, but I think it is a difference that for some patients makes a difference. In other words, I'm taking more responsibility for what I'm feeling, and I'm using it to understand also how other people in the person's life feel. Let me elaborate that, because it's now two other differences are coming to mind around what I just said. And again, they're differences between a Toyota and a car. They're not differences between a Toyota and a dinosaur. So they're differences within a family of ideas. I generally, as I am caught in an enactment with a patient, I will talk about what we are caught in, first of all, as I said, much more than what the patient alone is repeating. It becomes something we share, which I think enables the patient to assimilate and change in a way that places less burden on him, is less guilt or shame inducing. But I also I'm interested in their understanding what's happening between us, but I am maybe even more interested in their experiencing what it's like when it's different. So that, to my mind, what most relationalists do is they interpret the enactment. They point it out. They want the person to understand it. I find myself drawn into it, and then I want to work to actually experientially change it. It's close to the idea of the corrective emotional experience, which is less centered on interpreting an insight and more centered on establishing new experiences and new patterns. So that's one way in which it at least differs in emphasis or accent from some other relational versions. A second is, and then I'll take that question, which obviously is responsive to what I just said, so I'll try to make this short. The other part of where I think there's a difference is that as I read the contemporary relational literature, there's a tremendous emphasis on paying attention to what's going on in the room. And sort of taking what is happening in the room and the reworking of that as the primary curative process or experience. I see it more almost as a diagnostic experience more than a therapeutic experience. That's overly sharply drawing it, but what I mean by that is I think ultimately we are cured by life, not by therapy. That we are cured by living differently in the world and then getting different feedback in the world that begins to consolidate whatever changes we've made. So while I'm interested both in what's happening in the room and what's happening outside, and the Mobius strip is a very good illustration of that, because understanding what's happening right in the room helps me understand something the patient told me about what happened between him and his wife yesterday. I suddenly realize, oh, what went on is his wife felt the way I'm feeling now. I didn't quite get it then, but by my feeling this now, I get what his wife was feeling, and then I get what happens to him and how he gets caught in something. But ultimately, it's more important that he get along with his wife than that he get along with me. So that's where my primary focus is. But I still pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the room. But I think relationalists are a little too complacent about the sufficiency of paying attention to what's happening in the room. And I think that's because although the relational psychoanalysis is much more contextual than older psychoanalytic versions, just as you were saying, I think they retain, in an unexamined way, more of the intrapsychic theorizing than they're sometimes aware of. And I think the example of that is, even if now the two people together are engaged in this curative process in the room, there's still a kind of assumption what we work out between us fixes it inside you, and then you can go out into your life and everything else will start to be okay. I think what often happens is patients develop much better relationships with their therapist than they had before. They genuinely become healthier in the therapy room. Not just better able to get along with the therapist, but better able to be fully themselves, to feel the depths of their feelings even in that room, which is the kind of thing we want to happen in a deep way. But that doesn't necessarily carry over to the rest of their lives, because now paying homage back to the origins of my own integrative interests that I talked about, and my interests in the early behavioral efforts, one of the behaviorist concepts that I think is really important to keep in mind is stimulus discrimination. That we learn that something can be safe here and not here. We do that all the time. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I might do in other situations that I wouldn't do in this room, because certain behavior is appropriate in here and different behavior is appropriate outside. There's all sorts of ways in which we learn, in this room, I can feel almost everything I feel. I can know myself with depth. I can see the complexities of my life. I can see the pains. I can acknowledge my grandiosity, I can acknowledge my aspirations, I can acknowledge my yearnings. And then you go out and you're in a different self-state. And because we relate to other contexts. So I think I'm much more attentive to the outside world than most relationalists are. So those would be some of the ways in which I think it differs from other relational theories, but you're absolutely right. It's still just a variant of the set of relational theories that have evolved.
For a talk, very refreshing, and lots of the things that you say seems to me very like schema therapy that was developed in Columbia University. What do you have to say about this? About the ideas of schema therapy that probably are very similar to the core ways of dealing with the outside world and the inside world.
I think some of these, there are many sort of roughly parallel ways, each slightly different. The interpersonal therapies have a lot in common with what I do, and schema therapies do as well. The emphases are different. Part of the difference, in some way, every therapist does a different kind of therapy. I say I do integrative therapy, I say I do relational therapy, I say I do cyclical psychodynamic therapy. Most of all, what I do is Paul Wachtel therapy, and you do whatever your name is therapy, and so on. It's distinctive, but there are tremendous overlaps. And schema ideas of a wide range have been of special interest to me, even long before I became aware of schema therapy, for example, as a therapeutic point of view. Many, many years ago, I got interested in the concept in re-examining the concept of transference from a schema point of view, thinking of Piaget's concepts of schema and assimilation and accommodation, and thinking about one of the problems in the older versions, the one-person psychoanalytic versions of transference, is in those versions of transference is my distorting who you are, what you're like, because I have stored in me some old image from my interactions with my parents. And anything I see in you, it's just an excuse, it's really about me. And, part of what I was saying just a while ago about being caught in enactments is a lot of what is important to recognize is that the patient's distortions are also realities. It's the specific reality that they create in their little corner of the universe by the way they interact with others and elicit responses from others. And the schemas that we have about what other people are like, how they will respond to us, what interactions are like, always are some balance between our assimilating new experiences to our existing schemas, which is what the concept of transference emphasizes, and our accommodating our schemas to whatever is actually going on. And there's a war going on all the time between how much will be pulled this way, how much will be pulled that way, and that's part of how we decide where we're intervening, in a sense, what our reading is of those tensions and pulls. I'm not sure if that's sufficiently responsive to what you were saying, but it's at least my first initial response to it.
הפסקה. הפסקה.
Do you need a break?
I'm okay, but
Do you need a break?
I don't want to impose it on everybody else.
Continue.
Okay. But I'm going to show one of my own deep conflicts. I see several people raising their hands, and I have trouble deciding who should I call upon. So I'm going to take advantage of there being two other people I respect sitting up here on either side of me and let them take the responsibility of calling on somebody.
Well, first, thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us, and also your personal aspect. As in the therapy room, we come here also to have an encounter with you, and also other aspects of our interaction come into place. I want to have a short comment and a couple of questions. You'll decide what is fruitful to take up as you like. The comment is that about 1,000 years ago, I worked with Joseph Sandler, who was a psychoanalyst who came to Israel to establish the Freud Center. And this is just a comment as a ripple of what you said about behaviorists and psychoanalysts. And he was the editor then of the two major psychoanalytic reviews and journals. And he once told us the story that there is always a third censor, and the censor in the tribe of psychoanalysts of what you say in supervision and what you don't say in conferences and things like that. And one of the things he said, I wouldn't dare to say, was that I had a very, very rich patient in England. In London he worked, and he had trouble submitting his income tax report to the IRS or whatever. And he said, Sandler says that after doing a lot of interpretations and things like that, it came to the last 2 days, and Sandler himself became so anxious. He said, tomorrow you are bringing all your books into the clinic, and we are sitting together and we are submitting them. And that's what they do. They did. So I think you're right in that sense that we don't say a lot of things about all the tribes that we belong to when our supervisors say, oh, Gadi, there is a smell of Gestalt therapy here. What's going on? So this kind of thing you triggered in me while you were speaking. And he also talked about Anna Freud supervising one of the trainees. And he said the child came without, and he wants to eat. Should I interpret to the parents or to the child? And she said, first feed him. So I think this kind of things ties in very well for me with the ideas that you gave here. And now the couple of questions that you can ignore or choose one of them. One of them is that I wanted to know whether there were clients or patients that challenged you in such a way that you expanded your integration, that you went to study something like you did with Michelle, and the patients themselves, the clients, actually triggered that going away, and whether culture in any way, like Japanese American or Chinese American, or whether this comes into play in that integrative way of challenges. And the other question is, how do you teach integration? because there is a question, a small question, you know, a tiny one. But I'm referring specifically to a minor point within it, which is when I was trained, I remember my professor saying to me, you go to this behaviorist because she is just so religious about behaviorism or Skinnerian behavior. You should study with her first. And parallel to your psychoanalytic or psychodynamic and things, study with the religious. And I wonder whether you teach integrative from the start, or like yourself and most of us, you study first one thing, and I was a basketball player, you know this bit and then you build on it, on that, and you expand, like the brain expands our ideas. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts about that from the perspective. Mm-hmm. So, and you can evade both.
Well, I think now I actually may have to take a break because I have to run out and get my Israeli citizenship in order to be able to be here long enough to answer them all adequately. But they are all wonderful questions, so I'm sorely tempted. I think to begin with, I love that you started with Sandler, because he is, I think, a wonderful example of a psychoanalyst who does think in a way that is open to other ideas. And I think his discussions of role responsiveness are very, very close to some of what I'm talking about. And I also do think that probably the definition of good therapy is what we do that we won't tell our supervisors. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I want to speak to two other parts of what you asked. First, the issue of culture, because I think that's really, really important. I think that one other part of what the point of view that I've been describing today has led me to more and more is, and it's another kind of Mobius strip, where culture and individual personality and culture and individual personality just weave back and forth. We are such culturally situated creatures that we virtually don't have psyches that are culture-free at all. We are so immersed in cultural assumptions, cultural meanings, cultural values, that even our most intimate interactions are shaped by that. Not shaped in a one-directional way, but again in this bi-directional way. And in fact, I've been very, very interested in these cultural elements for a long time. Back in the 1980s, I wrote a book called The Poverty of Affluence. And just a couple of years ago wrote a new edition of it that I think has sold a total of 6 copies or something like that. The first version sold better. The second one, it was the wrong time. But the center of it was how this vicious circle conception that is central to my thinking about personality applies in society more generally. And I was particularly interested in, and I remain very interested in, how we are shaped by the pervasive materialism of our society and the ways in which our most basic sense of who we are, where we belong in life, what our needs are shaped by this. And then for many people, for example, the kind of vicious circle that happens, many people now, in order to have what they think they need, which includes a wardrobe, for example, even for a relatively modest person, just a kind of a typical middle-class person probably has in their home enough to clothe an entire village, right? But we think we have to have all these things, and then comes the new season, we, quote, need new things, and so on. That, or people, you know, you have a phone, but it's not just that you have a phone, you need a new phone. I see it in my grandchildren, you know, they need new phone, you know. They need a new phone before I sneeze, it seems. Why? And why do we let and encourage the phone companies to make phones that force you to need a new phone? It all is part of a pattern of living which, it's not simply the critique of materialism. What's important, the way it fits into this cyclical dynamic that goes deep inside of us, is that in order to support the way of life that most of us think of as not elaborate, but as just ordinary, normal, what everybody has, we have to work an enormous number of hours to support that. And then we work harder than we should, longer than we should, under more stress than we should. And then what do we do with that stress for many people in our society? And especially, we're a little bit privileged in here because we work in a profession that has some intrinsic meaningfulness. And it makes, hopefully, our working hours not just something for some other purpose. But most people work to earn a living or to advance, and often in contexts that are not particularly humane and not particularly psychologically meaningful or satisfying. And then when that characterizes your life, that stress, that emptiness, in a society that defines what's good as having more stuff, then you need to work even harder to have that stuff. And then the more you need the stuff, the harder you have to work. The harder you have to work, the more you need the stuff. It's just one more vicious circle. So the social values and the social pressures are really built into the way we organize our personality. I also recall the example I started with, in the first actual example I gave, when Sharon first called my attention to my evasions, which she accurately and helpfully did, remember, was the person who can't say no as readily and who builds up anger and so on. And I gave, a number of years ago, I gave a talk in Japan that was about, where I used illustrations like that. And the Japanese people in the audience and the people I spoke to afterwards really thought that my description of the psychological experience was off. That their experience is that there isn't that kind of, I want this, you want that. There's somehow an assumption of a kind of a smoothly integrated, we all want the same thing, we all fit. We had interesting conversations afterwards that sort of illuminated that it wasn't quite that simple or dichotomous, but clearly the experience of what I was describing in my Western way of describing it felt quite off and alien to them. And so they were talking about dynamics in a different context, And we kind of worked together in thinking about different forms of cyclical psychodynamics. And I'll be very interested to see how this proceeds. The next president of Sepi is going to be a man from Japan. So we will see how some of these ideas play out still further with that different kind of input. Now you'll notice that I have avoided answering that big question about training, even though it might be interesting to become an Israeli citizen and be able to vote in your elections, because ours are now even worse. But I will delay that because it is a big question, but it's crucially important, and I probably will come back to it even tonight, because my guess is that I'm only evading it because I've been monologuing too much in response to what you said, but my guess is other people are going to prod it, and then I'll come back to it.
My question pertains to your developmental narrative. And, needless to say that every model, every therapeutic model relies on a certain developmental narrative. With certain overlaps between this and that narrative. So my question pertains to if you can talk a little bit about your developmental narrative. You talked about therapy occurs in the real world, and maybe it is somehow related to that. By the way, Winnicott would agree with you. Winnicott once said, and this is a quote from his own writing, that when a successful psychoanalytic child therapy occurs, 50% of the success has to be attributed to the child's parents, their relatives, the school, and the life, the village. One has to admit, he says, that 50% of the success has to be attributed to the village. In any event, what is your developmental narrative, and how would it be translated in the way you would recommend, or maybe you do, child therapy, and other people who are working that way, that you can be inspired by, share ideas with?
Okay. First, as a kind of shameless self-promotion that isn't quite self-promotion, but self-promotion by proxy, promotion of my wife in this case. One of the best books I know that integrates work with children and the ideas that I've been thinking of is a book that my wife wrote called Treating Troubled Children and Their Families. That is a kind of integration of systemic thinking, individual psychodynamic thinking, and cognitive behavioral thinking. In terms of the developmental model, the way I've been thinking about it, particularly in the last couple of years, centers on ideas of attachment, but thinking of attachment less in the way that a great deal of the attachment literature puts it, and I'm not here being critical of that literature, I'm just distinguishing two different conceptions. As most of you know, a great deal of the attachment literature centers on attachment categories. Secure attachment, insecure attachment, different kinds of insecure attachment, continuities between attachment status early in life and attachment status late in life. And I think all of that is enormously valuable work. But what has, I think, not been emphasized quite as much, and what is the heart of how I'm thinking of it more, is attachment processes. And I see in two ways it's at the center of my developmental thinking. For one thing, one of the things I think we need to be aware of is we've developed models of psychopathology that are based on what goes wrong in life. And there's a kind of assumption that implicit in many of our models that what we want to find is, where did something go wrong? How can we fix it in a way? I'm not putting this well, so pretend you didn't hear me say it that way, because I'm sort of meandering my way toward finding a better way to say it. Let me put it differently. I think that every single one of us learns to be more comfortable with certain parts of ourself and less comfortable with other parts of ourself. Now that sounds a lot like, and is a lot like, standard psychoanalytic thinking in a way. But the difference is, I think, or at least a subtle difference, is there's no way to evade that in the very highlighting of certain parts of ourselves, other parts of ourselves go into shadow. So, for example, here I am actually very comfortable and enjoying this kind of interaction that a lot of people would find challenging, right? It's not, it looks like, it seems like it's not that easy to talk to 100 people and give answers to difficult, really intelligently challenging questions. I like that. That is the part of me I know well and have embraced. But you also heard me say, and it was only partially in jest, I wanted Anat or Sharon to choose who would answer the question, because the part of me that sort of is the authoritative selector of who gets, I'm not as comfortable with. And I kind of grew up in a family where I only actually in recent years have come to understand that let me put it, I have always not wanted to have birthday parties as an adult. Why? Because for the very reason that at those birthday parties would be gathered all the people I love, all the people that are important to me, family and friends, that would be a really uncomfortable situation for me. That sounds odd, but it is, because then whoever I'm talking to, I'm aware of who I'm not talking to. That in the very act of relating to one person, I'm aware of ignoring another person. I now understand better what went on in my own family that kind of highlighted that. That's a point of vulnerability for me. Other people, there's a lot of other people who are very comfortable at parties celebrating them, but wouldn't be comfortable in this situation. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. Those of you who are research-oriented, if you know the Q sort, life is a Q sort rather than a Likert scale. It's not a matter of more or less. It's always some things more than others, some things less than others. So in the very act of even the very best parent who induces what we would describe as a very secure attachment, the very act of being loving can also mean that some parts of the self are submerged, because no parent can be equally responsive to, equally loving toward every single feature of their child. If you love your child's intelligence and assertiveness, it's harder to love their cluelessness. It's harder to love their shyness, and so on. And we all manifest so many varied traits that every one of us is both strong and vulnerable. And that's at the core of development, and it helps us therapeutically because it means that in our perceptions of people's vulnerabilities, we're not seeing them just as having weaknesses. We're seeing their humanity. We're seeing it against the background of their strengths. And it means that what we're trying to do is to help people to re-assimilate the parts of themselves that they have cast out, not only because of threats or dangers, as was highlighted in early psychoanalytic theorizing, castration anxiety being the sort of most dramatic version of it, but a whole host of threatening situations. But we withdraw from parts of ourselves out of the pleasure of other parts of ourselves being loved so much. You know, that love is an addicting drug. And when our parents love this part of us, we kind of turn away from the parts of us that they are not as responsive to, even if they're not being rejecting. So we all live our lives, you know, with kind of uneven development. You know, it's up and down. Nobody has strengths across the board, comforts across the board. The very act or way of being comfortable with this part of yourself almost includes some discomfort with that part of yourself. And so part of what we're doing is helping people to sort of re-embrace the parts of themselves that they haven't embraced, especially if and when those have been involved in the distresses that they bring to us to work with. So that's one part of the developmental scheme, that it comes out of what we put forth and know best from our developmental experiences, what we cast into shadow, what the consequences of that are, what the life structure we begin to build is. And then the cyclical psychodynamic aspect of it is that ultimately we can't go back and undo or redo what happened back then. We can only look at where it is now. It's a kind of field theory view, where over time, as we have put forth, and everybody's, the most abject, poorly developed, poorly functioning patient has strengths, including some that likely we don't have, because there are so many possible variants of being human. But they also have, all of us, ways of being that, again, elicit responses from other people that keep us going in certain ways that become self-perpetuating. And so development is an ongoing cyclical process. So understanding the process is important. Understanding the origins can be helpful, but when you're working with somebody, whether it's a child who has, of course, already developed a personality structure, whether it's an adult, you can only really work with who has this person come, what have they cast into shadow, what are the ways that keep what's in shadow, and how can we make that safer? That's a kind of short, superficial version.
So you mentioned earlier starting out at a time where there was this great rift between psychoanalysis and behavioral therapy. And I was thinking about today we have this endless array of acronyms for different therapy types. And do you still find yourself integrating new techniques or thought or ideas? And if so, under what criteria? Under evidence criteria or subjective relation to it?
Well, I'm not a fan of the acronyms. I was saying, I think this morning, that our field suffers from acronymphomania. I think acronyms are it's part of the same cultural phenomenon I was talking about before. It's branding. It's the competitive, here's my brand, I'm going to create my niche. So I rarely adapt an acronym per se, which means I rarely am adapting it because it is, quote, evidence-based. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in evidence. I'm very interested in evidence. But I think that evidence-based therapy, the very term is a kind of propaganda term. And what I mean by that, because again, I take the need for evidence very seriously. I don't mean to be dismissive of psychotherapy research or the need for evidence at all. But what I mean by it being a propaganda name is, like, I'll give you an example. In the PhD program that I teach in, we have certain courses that are labeled evidence-based therapy. And I think a lot of programs in the United States, particularly because for the APA to accredit programs, you need to have that veneer. So certain courses are called evidence-based therapy. I don't think there's a single person on the faculty who believes that the other things they teach in other courses have no evidence for them. It's not like there's evidence-based therapy and then there's faith-based therapy. Each approach has different kinds and versions of evidence. Some certainly have more solid evidence than others, but again, I was talking this morning about my reservations about, for example, randomized controlled trials in psychotherapy, which are often the basis for calling certain approaches, certain acronyms often, evidence-based, and implicitly others not, because they don't have that. When you do a randomized controlled trial in a medical setting of a medication, one of the very crucial features of that is that it be a double-blind study. If it's not a double-blind study, people are not likely to take it very seriously as rigorous. Even if it's randomized and controlled, if it's not double-blind, it's not a high-quality study. Every single psychotherapy randomized controlled trial that I know of is not double-blind. It's almost impossible to imagine a double-blind psychotherapy study. So randomized controlled trials are not a gold standard. That doesn't mean they're not useful. They're one of many forms of evidence that is configurationally convergent. Studies a whole range of process outcome studies that look at particular kinds of therapeutic events and regularities that may not have been anticipated, that you can find across different approaches that aren't a test of a particular manualized, acronymed study, but of a process of therapeutic change. That's important evidence. So I'm always interested in those kinds of broader sorts of evidence And I'm mostly interested in processes that are mobilized. And I'm aware that different therapeutic approaches mobilize even similar processes in somewhat different ways. So there are lots of ways I can learn from them. And when I go to Sepi meetings, I encounter versions of therapy I didn't know well before, and I adapt them in some way. I rarely just follow them according to their own protocol, again, partly because each of us does therapy as ourselves. But I take them seriously, and I try to learn from them, and I try to continually bring them in because, you know, the reality is I think I'm a pretty good therapist, but I certainly don't get 100% results. I still have a lot to learn. I still have cases that don't go so well, and even ones that do sometimes take longer than I wish they did. So there's always something to learn. At the same time, when that new stuff comes in this branded way, I think that is something that we need to be a little bit more skeptical about.
ואחרי זה, בסדר?
I have a bit of a follow-up question regarding development, which I think also has some clinical implications. It reminded me when you showed the Mobius Trick thing, it felt a bit like a straw man when you compare it to the classical psychoanalytic way, in the sense that I think all psychoanalytic thinking, Klein and others, would absolutely agree that the outside and the inside have a cyclical dimension to it, taking in what your parents, the outside influence, and what you feel. The major difference being the different proneness, or how much you are being affected by the outside world across the developmental span. And I would imagine this Mobius strip changing. You're not as open to outside influence when you're 2 years as you're 5 years or 10 years or 50 years. And so the emphasis on early years is not only because of just ignoring this self-perpetuating continuous influence of your reality and your world, but it's also because in those years you were much more prone, and you have those early experiences have a bigger weight. So I kind of wonder what's your take on how much do you go to early experience versus early, like present life or actual world?
Well, I would respond to that in a few ways, because I think it raises some very important questions. I think, first of all, the Mobius strip is a metaphor. It's not a kind of literal explanation. So in some way, when you say it's a straw man, I would agree, just in the sense that it's not a full-blown, intended as a full-blown theory of development per se. I do think, though, that there are variations, significant variations, in how different psychoanalytic formulations, how genuinely attentive they are to that, the influence of the outside as well as in shaping the inside and vice versa. And I think Kleinians are a good example in the opposite direction in some way. If we think of, for example, the reception of Bowlby in England for decades, Bowlby's work was largely rejected because Bowlby was emphasizing the importance of the real experience with parents. And the psychoanalytic establishment in Britain in particular for many years said, no, it's all internal, endogenous fantasies. It's not about what's really happening.
Most of us are beyond that now.
Well, I hope so also, but I think it's an example of a version of psychoanalytic thinking that was much less receptive to that. I'm all for our being beyond that, but I think we also need to be alert to where it's a veneer and how deeply it goes, in a sense, since that was such a powerful constraint for so long. But I also very much agree that the degree to which we are subject to the influence of external events and of what is happening to us, and the degree to which it can change us, is much greater in the early years than later. By the time we are adults, we have engaged in so many hundreds of thousands of confirming experiences that are these cyclical experiences, that change comes with much greater difficulty, and a few different experiences are not likely in themselves to make a difference. So in one sense, earlier is much more important. Certainly, for example, if we are thinking about preventing psychopathology, we want to intervene as early as we can. Early experience makes a big difference. It skews our development much more. But if you're working with an adult, what I'm less in agreement with is the idea, and I'm not necessarily assuming you are putting forth this idea, but it's in the air, as it were, right? That because the early years are so important, which I do agree, we then have to spend a lot of the therapy time looking at those earlier years, because you can't close the window after the bird has flown out. Now you have to deal with the bird being out there in the world. And so you have to deal with the circumstances that currently exist and some perspective on how we got there, some understanding of one's developmental course is one of the things that contributes to change, potentially. But for me, even though the earliest years are the most important, they don't have the greatest weight in the therapeutic effort, because now we're dealing with the accumulated consequences of, as I said, hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of interactions, in a way. And that's the reality that we're now dealing with. And we are stuck with a harder to change situation than if we had been looking at the person when they were 2 years old. But that's what we're stuck with then.
We must. Last question.
I want to ask a more pragmatic question about techniques. You spoke about the importance of carrying out change outside the clinical room. What type of interventions or techniques do you use to ensure such a change outside the clinic?
Well, I could. It will vary from patient to patient, of course. Sometimes we might work together on how a patient might interact differently with their spouse, their boss, their friends, and so on, and then, rehearse it, examine it, and then look at what happened and look at the consequences and try to fine-tune it. Sometimes it's monitoring it more, paying attention to what happened, asking questions about it. Sometimes it can even be, I hate the phrase because it sounds authoritarian, but it's sort of come down that way from productive cognitive behavioral roots. We can give homework, assignments, etc. I like more to think of it as let's collaborate on suggestions of ways to follow through between sessions. But there's a wide range of ways of trying to examine what goes on in the person's daily life and try to help the person to change that, either by working on it in the session, by following up on how it's going on outside the session, and going back and forth on that. It's hard to give a specific, concrete example that would cover all of it. That's a somewhat general answer, but I'm aware that it's so general that even though we're just about ready to stop, if anybody has a way of...
But if I may, I would like to share what I learned from what Paul writes on the technique. I think that for me, you challenge the binary that for creating change in the outworld, you have to use behavioral technique. And for creating change in the inner world, you have to use more psychodynamic or more humanistic or whatever reflective techniques. So I think you help me to challenge this balance, because sometimes using behavioral technique, like encouraging a client to try new experience, or to like I encourage a patient of mine to stop checking in the WhatsApp if his past partner is connected. And what he felt is that he achieved control and that he is stronger. So it created a change in his inner world, but it was behavioral. So I think it challenges the cyclical psychodynamic model, challenges the dichotomy that if we want to go to the outworld, we need a behavioral intervention, and if we want to get to the inside, we need to reflect. Sometimes the dialectical tension between the two. Am I right?
Well, what I would say is part of what we do psychodynamically is we help people rework their perceptions and memories, and I will definitely do that. By tomorrow morning, I will be telling my wife that what I said to this group was exactly what Sharon actually said. I agree 100%.
We have a few minutes before closing. Would you like to say 2 sentences about when to start to practice integration?
Okay. Couldn't escape it. Okay. Actually, I don't really want to escape it. I think it's a really important question. I know that there are basically 2 schools of thought about it. Some people who feel first learn one thing well, others who feel learn integration from the beginning. I tend to fall in that second camp. And the reason is because my own bias is in learning the one thing well. You actually learn it better if you learn it in an integrative way. In other words, I think we can teach psychoanalytic thought better if it's an open-ended psychoanalytic thought that is receptive to the behavioral intervention, the systemic intervention, and so on. I think that we can teach cognitive behavioral work better if it's from the beginning receptive to the complexities and contradictions and conflicts that people experience as they go about living their lives. I think we can teach family systems work better if it doesn't treat the figures as interchangeable, but really looks at how each element in the system is themselves a complex system with thoughts and feelings and so on. So I think each version of what have become the standard ways of working, it can be as narrow as the acronyms or as broad as the 3 or 4 large tribes in our field: psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, humanistic, experiential, and family systems. That either way, any version of that, I think, is better when it, from the beginning, is conceived of as including elements of the others. So my own bias is to be thinking integratively from the beginning.
And having said that, because we have to start including 2 things. First of all, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank Paul for another evening of pearls, at least a few pearls that I'm taking from this evening. Second thing, which is extremely important to us, is Sepi and integration in Israel. So thanks to Ofer Mauer and Sharon and others, there's an Israeli branch of Sepi, just being born and raised. So any of you who are interested, want to contribute, have ideas, you're more than welcome to contact any of us and become a member of the International Sepi, which thanks to Paul 2 years ago, I joined. And it's really a pleasure. So you're all more than welcome.
Thank you. The coffee is not cold.